From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You're listening to the Big Ideas Podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, Professor of English and American Culture Studies and the Director of ICS. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations present and past who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts toward decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who've been living and working on this land from time immemorial. On this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Niki Kalaf-Hughes, an ICS Faculty Fellow, to discuss how we can approach communication with elected representatives to ensure better representation within our political systems. Niki is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at BGSU and a spring 2022 ICS Faculty Fellow. Her primary research is in American politics, focusing on legislative behavior and representation. She teaches courses in American political institutions, race and ethnic politics, and research methods. Thanks for joining me today, Niki.
Thank you.
Your work focuses on representation in governmental systems. Could you describe your background in this subject and how it led into your current research project?
I did my PhD at UC Davis, and I focused there primarily on how questions about immigration are reflected in Congress and at the state level. So how members of Congress deal with immigration policy, how states deal with it, and kind of how it's different. And that led me into questions of representation more broadly. So how are different groups represented at state and federal levels? Who gets representation? And when is it most effective? And which legislators are most effective and entrepreneurial in what they're doing? And so it led to this project because in the summer and early fall of last year, I found myself writing to my local elected officials, specifically my school board, quite a bit, trying to encourage them to have a mask mandate to keep the kids safe, particularly my son who's in elementary school. And they either wouldn't respond or they responded with something that I knew wasn't necessarily accurate. And so I got a little mad, and then I realized I could actually study what was going on and find out what was actually happening. And so I started filing a series of public records requests, both of my district and then eventually every district in the state of Ohio, to see kind of who was writing, what they were writing about, and how that influenced policy.
I want to rewind a little bit. Even before you got into your PhD program, what was your relationship to politics like? How did you sort of get interested in the field more broadly?
I actually had very little relationship to politics that I thought about. Probably until my second or third year in college, I hadn't really thought much about politics. Most of the work and the courses I had taken were focused on international relations. But then I realized that I had observed a lot of politics without even realizing it. I grew up in Los Angeles, and during the 90s, the LA area had a variety of things going on, both in terms of the Los Angeles riots, questions about criminal justice and criminal justice reform, police reform, and then statewide in California, Prop 187, which aimed to prevent undocumented immigrants from attending public school, accessing non-emergency medical care, et cetera. And my school hosted a variety of walkouts and demonstrations on that, even when I was in junior high. And I didn't necessarily connect that to politics until I was in grad school. Politics was far more abstract until I realized, oh, wait, no, this is actually far more local than I even realized.
Well, on that subject of the local, part of what you're talking about at each of these different scales, from the hyper-local to the national, is about representation. So how would you define equitable representation in politics?
How I would define it is not what we actually have, but how I would define equitable representation is everyone's voice is heard. Everyone has the opportunity to make their voice heard, and should they choose to do so, everyone's voice is actually heard. And we know that's not the case. Not everyone has both that opportunity, and when they do have the opportunity, not everyone's voice is listened to.
How do you think the perceived detachment or inaccessibility of elected officials affects how constituents think of their own roles in political systems?
I think for the most part, people feel pretty removed. we know a lot of people don't vote. Turnout levels are the highest during presidential races, but most of the positions that affect our daily life are not the president. They are these far more local things that often occur in off-cycle elections, and we don't necessarily see the turnout there. Additionally, voting, like all forms of political participation, take time, effort, and resources, and those are not equally distributed among the population. People can take time off from their jobs to vote, but they may not even get paid to do that. And as we see states trying to restrict voting locations, voting hours, and early voting, it makes voting far more difficult for a large segment of the population.
And in particular, you're really talking about, right, folks who don't have flexible schedules, who may not have their own transportation, things like that. So economic and other factors make a big difference.
Exactly. And even things like childcare, because even if you can afford the cost of voting, so you can take that hour off of work and you don't miss that hour of pay, if you don't have childcare and you have young children, you may not be in a position to wait in a 2 or 3 hour voting line. Or if you have health problems, or just for a variety of reasons, you can't take that much time out of your day, it makes it impossible to vote. And that is what we see happening in a lot of states right now.
Your ICS Fellowship Project considers how effective communication can better encourage elected officials to truly represent and respond to their constituents. Can you give us an overview of this particular project that you've been working on during the fellowship period?
So this particular project looks at a very local aspect, specifically school boards, and kind of how and when school boards hear from their constituents and how and when they choose to respond, and whether that response turns into a policy response or more of just a, hey, we hear you, and that's kind of the end of it. I started with public records requests in Wood County, and what I asked for was all constituent emails, so all emails to every member of the school board between January 1st and August 22nd of 2021. That related to masks, vaccines, and critical race theory. And I picked those topics partly because I knew they were going to be salient everywhere. Not every district is facing levies or questions about like sports facilities or those kinds of common things. So I knew everyone would have emails about masks. Additionally, specifying topics allowed school boards to provide me with the information because it didn't run afoul, in most cases, of Ohio's sunshine laws that say that requests can't be overly broad. So I couldn't just cast a net for every single email that someone had written. And so I started with Wood County, and then I expanded out to the entire state of Ohio, which is about 613 public school districts in the state. And I requested copies of all of their emails. I have responses from about 47% of districts, but they're still coming in. So I just got one actually yesterday. So it's been kind of a slow process of getting this information, but part of that is because it's incredibly time consuming for the districts to pull this information. And then if they choose to redact the necessary information from it, that just takes time because it's not automated. And so it's man hours of office staff sitting there reading these emails and then removing the identifying information. And so what I did is I got all those emails and then I counted them and I looked at what the arguments were. So what were people saying? What were people asking their district for? If they were making a request for a mask mandate, what was their motivation behind that? Did they provide a reason? If they were making an argument to not have a mask mandate, what was the argument behind that? There were very few emails about vaccines. It was often mentioned in passing or not at all. And the emails about critical race theory, they were overwhelmingly against critical race theory. And so I looked at what the arguments were there as well as who they came from, because some of them you were able to identify that they were not in the district. And so I looked at kind of who was writing those emails. And then I looked at whether there was a policy change. So did districts who saw a lot of communication supporting a mask mandate choose to implement a mask mandate? Or did they just ignore it? And then how did other factors like partisanship, the type of district, whether it was a suburban district, an urban district, or rural district, and then COVID, whether the district had a lot of cases of COVID or very few cases of COVID, how that affected what a district decided to do. And then what I found is that the letters actually did matter. And it wasn't so much the argument in the letter. It wasn't whether someone was arguing for safety, whether they cited experts. It was just that they wanted the mask mandate combined with rising case rates. So rising case rates on their own were not enough to generate a mask mandate. And letters on their own were not enough to generate a mask mandate. But together, rising case rates with a lot of letters to the school board is when we saw school boards issue mask mandates. And so it shows that constituent communications actually have an effect, that you're not just necessarily raging into the void when you're emailing your district, but that it matters in terms of a policy outcome. And so I thought that was really interesting. And in particular, the arguments weren't the key point. It was the overall message. It wasn't what they were citing or the data they were citing or what their claimed expertise was. It was the overall argument that was what registered in the back of school board members' minds. And based on interviews with school board members, that's what they said as well. So it was nice that both the quantitative data as well as the qualitative interviews work together.
Could you talk a little bit more about your decision to use both methods, right? To sort of have this aggregate data across the whole state, but to also do interviews. Why was that important to you? And what do you think it helped you to understand better or differently?
So I'll be honest in that I'm typically far more of a quantitative person than I am a qualitative person. But I thought in this case, it would be really nice to see if what we see in the data was actually reflected in my conversations with school board members. And it was not as easy as I anticipated to get school board members to kind of have these conversations with me, despite keeping everything confidential in terms of their identity and where they worked. But it was really interesting in that most of the people I talked to said they really like public input. They listen to it, they respond, they read what people send, and that they do incorporate it into their decisions within reason, provided the communication is respectful in tone, and that they had seen a lot more of that type of communication recently, but that they do try to take into account kind of what the people are saying and are interested in, because they know everyone is writing, for the most part, because they want what's best for their kids.
Part of what your research examines are the barriers to constituent representation. You've talked about some of those already in terms of like voting access. In terms of these local policies, what were some of the things you found? Like, what correlations did you find between political participation and representation and differences amongst the various school districts in the state of Ohio?
So Ohio divides their school districts into what they call a typology, and there's 8 levels, and it essentially measures the type of districts in terms of rural, urban, suburban, small town, as well as a level of student poverty. They kind of group their districts accordingly. And what I found is that districts that were suburban, and suburban districts are classified as either suburban low poverty or suburban very low poverty, suburban districts had by far more communications than any of the other types of districts. And these suburban districts, either very low student poverty or low student poverty, are the kind that people have the time, effort, and resources to be able to write these communications. And people can take time out of their day to do this. They can take time out of their day to track down these emails and the mechanisms to actually contact their school board members, because it's not something that's always readily available. And so having the time and the ability and the know-how really matters in terms of making your voice heard. And that's controlling for levels of education. It's controlling even for broadband access and internet. It's these districts that have more wealth and time, because income was significant as well in determining who is actually writing.
Was there a similar relationship to getting a response back?
In terms of just a, hey, we hear you, yes. Those are the districts that actually replied. Those are the ones that actually saw, particularly the very low poverty, a much higher response rate. It had no effect on policy change, but it did have an effect in terms of a turnaround of being like, a constituent sends an email, the school board writes back with even something as simple as, thank you for reaching out, we appreciate your concern. And that's the end of it. But a desire to make their voice, the constituent have their voice feel heard and represented.
Do you have any advice for how constituents in less wealthy districts might get better representation and or communication?
I think it's going to involve reaching out. It's going to involve finding the contact information, which may not be easily available. Finding the contact information for your school board and reaching out. And from talking to school board members, it's not just a matter of emailing, but even showing up at school board meetings, which again takes even more time than writing an email. But organizing, having one person go or multiple people go, showing up at a school board meeting, everyone I talked to said was really important, but with the caveat that they are not able to respond. And this is something that multiple board members said is people often misunderstood the point of open comment during school board meetings, and they expected a response from the school board members right there. That's not actually even usually allowed, because that open comment time is just set aside for public comment and doesn't really allow for members to argue back or even just respond. They just have to say thank you and then give the next person their time. But it does help the school board members kind of know what the public is thinking and even put a face to a name, essentially, that they might see in their email if that's followed up. What they also said in talking with different school board members is that in-person communication, having a meeting, making a phone call, and then kind of sending a letter led to more respectful tone and kind of a better dialogue. Email offers an anonymity that we often see in online comments that in-person interaction or phone calls often doesn't. And so they really encourage people to reach out, but to do so respectfully and kind of know the boundaries of what school board members are and are not allowed to do and when.
It's an interesting, like the last couple of years have been an interesting experiment in many ways, right? Because these issues that you're talking about are so local, right? And yet, because maybe in part things were moved to Zoom and not physically present, we saw an acceleration of the vitriol and the kind of trolling that is typically reserved for online communications where you actually don't really know the person you're talking to.
And that's really what the school board members said. I spoke to some that had seen police presence at school board meetings when there had been none. I spoke to some that had police have to come to their homes or sit outside their homes or escort them to and from their cars at school board meetings because things had gotten so aggressive. And that is one thing that the literature, like the scholarly literature, shows about email communication is when the level of vitriol becomes so high, sometimes email might be better because you may get someone's attention in a way, assuming it's respectful, that you wouldn't trying to speak to them in person because they're so prepared for someone to be aggressive.
Your research also finds that gender matters a great deal in political representation from the local to the federal levels. Can you explain that relationship for us and what you think the implications are for voting behavior and constituent communications?
So if we look at the political science research generally, women are just better at their jobs, just flat out better at their jobs. They are more effective legislators. They are better able to move their bills through the legislative process better at the federal level. They are more entrepreneurial. They're more collaborative. They're more willing to work across the aisle and to kind of build consensus that's necessary, which may be some of the reasons that they are so effective. Women at the state level are also more effective, and they are more likely to reply to constituent concerns and reply in a meaningful way rather than just hand wave. And there's a lot of kind of discussion as to why. And one argument is that women have to overcome so much to just get elected in the first place that they have to just be better than the men that get elected. And it could be that women know they're in for that fight, and so far more highly qualified women run than, say, your average male candidate. Whatever the reason is, women at all levels are better at their jobs, and we see this with school boards as well. School boards with a greater share of women elected to office are more likely to reply with a greater frequency than school boards that are made primarily of men. And this doesn't necessarily mean policy will change, but you are far more likely to get a reply, to get an acknowledgement of having your voice heard, and to have that connection if you have elected more women to your school board.
What patterns do you notice about that gender representation across the state of Ohio?
I think what's interesting is that school boards in Ohio are overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white. So there's not a lot of racial or gender diversity on them. And I think that's something that needs to change. We don't even have enough minority school board members to really make any generalized claims about their behavior because they're so few and far between that it's kind of hard to assess the racial differences versus just the districts themselves. For women, we do have enough, and it would really suggest to me the importance of electing women, whether that's because they're more qualified or just because they bring a different perspective to the job. Electing women and making it so women have equal representation to men on school boards would improve representation, at every level we know, but now also at the school board level.
We're going to take a quick break. Thanks for listening to the Big Ideas podcast.
Question. Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Welcome back to the Big Ideas Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with ICS Faculty Fellow, Dr. Niki Kalaf-Hughes. Niki, your focus on local communication between constituents and school boards represents an interesting microcosm of political communication more generally. Could you tell us about the importance and the advantages of getting involved at the local level? Why is the local level so important?
So the local level is really important for a couple different reasons. From the most practical standpoint, your local policy is going to affect you far more than something that happens at the national level. Obviously, national politics are important. National politics do make up the bulk of my research, so I'm not going to say they don't matter. But local politics matter far more than we realize. Even something as silly as like how our streets get plowed, when our trash gets picked up, what the boundaries of school districts look like, all of that happens at the local level. And we see a far greater impact from that than we might from some sort of very small congressional policy that has to do with like foreign affairs or something. So we do have a lot of effects of things that affect us when it comes out of the local level, and we tend to pay the least amount of attention to it. So I think it's really important in that way. In terms of a national perspective, if we look at how people ascend to state and federal office, they often start at the local level. So understanding how these individuals behave on a school board or a city council might tell us how they're going to behave at the state level, and then might tell us how they're going to behave should they decide to go serve in Congress as well. And so looking at that kind of that ascension to different levels of office, I think is really important, and understanding the behavior of individuals when they serve in their communities can shed light on what happens far later on a different stage.
How do you imagine the results of your research empowering the public in terms of whether it's how school board members behave, how the public might, respond to local elected officials?
I think a couple things. I think it would be great if people kind of took some of the conclusions from this and actually reached out. But I think communicating your policy preferences or your thoughts to your elected officials is important at every level because we do see it get incorporated into policy. That being said, I think people also need to understand the constraints of officials at every level. School board members are constrained by things from the Ohio Department of Education, the state of Ohio as far as the school funding model, which in Ohio has been declared unconstitutional multiple times. So there's things that school board members have no power over, and it doesn't matter how much you write to them, you're actually writing to the wrong audience. So knowing who to write to in terms of even like what level to write to, I think is really important. But I think people need to understand the time it takes, but then see if they're able to find that time or to find someone else who can represent them in representing themselves, understanding that not everyone is going to be able to find that time. And so I think making your voice heard matters.
Do you have any advice for school board members and, folks in those positions, the ways that they might kind of reach out more or be more responsive to their constituents?
I think replying, even a basic like thanks for your email, goes a long way. And again, respect is a two-way street. And I saw in some of my data that school board members were far more hostile than the people that were writing to them in some instances. And so I would say maybe don't do that, but respond to emails and respond truthfully. And I think that becomes challenging in a very polarized political environment because while school board members are responsible for kind of the administration of the schools and oversight, often they are partisan despite the nonpartisan nature of their office. And so I think that is challenging, but I think keeping in mind that even just a response that someone's email has been received goes a long way.
A major issue in the political participation of individuals, whether it's through voting or communication with representatives, is the sense of disillusionment that can occur when participation isn't recognized. How do we as educators and researchers address and help to break this cycle to return a sense of political agency to our system, to constituents and representatives?
I think it's educating people on what their options are, what the different types and levels of government actually do, and where the power actually is. And I think a lot of times people don't understand what the different levels of government do at every level, from the strangest local district to the federal government, and then how to access those systems. And I think people don't really realize that participation can go far beyond voting. And even at election time, people don't always vote. So I think it's an education process, both of what the different levels do, who has oversight of what, and then how to access those people to make your voice heard, knowing that sometimes your voice won't get heard, and that's fine too. But every little bit counts.
One of the ways you plan to put your research into action is by leading a community workshop to help individuals more effectively craft appeals to their representatives. What methods of communication has your research identified that might be more rhetorically effective?
I think in terms of what methods of communication, email is by far and away both like the easiest in terms of time and cost. And then some board members have specified a preference for phone calls. But again, I think that really depends on the board. I would recommend email because it's easy. You don't have to wait for a callback. It's not subject to any sort of postal delays or scanning, which happens at the federal level to ensure that everything coming in is safe. It can go directly to the recipient. And as far as rhetorical strategies, everyone I spoke to, and based on what my data have shown, respectful communication goes a long way. And it does not need to be a 3-page, single-spaced epic poem of a letter. It's be brief. Have an effective subject. Say what you are looking for, who you are. First, say who you are in your relation to the district. And then what you're looking for, kind of what it means, what will that do for the community, and say thank you, and that's it. And this is true at the school board level, it's true at the city council level, it's true at the state level, and it's true at the federal level. A lot of people forget that one of Congress's main jobs is oversight, specifically oversight of the bureaucracy, and they receive letters from very important things like, I need help with my VA benefits, to hilarious things like the TV on my flight wasn't working. I need you to call Delta and tell them that I'm pretty upset because, right, Delta is an airline, the FAA is part of the DOT, and so the Department of Transportation theoretically should be on that. And being as clear in your communication, however important or silly it is, I think is really important to being able to get a good and effective response. No one wants to read a 3-page rant about why they're so dumb. They want to know how they can help you. And so having that request right up front and be brief and respectful, I think is kind of a key strategy into actually getting the outcome that you want.
One thing we've seen a lot of over, probably the last 10 or more years is kind of organized campaigns where there's sort of, here's the template, fill this in and send it in. Is that effective in trying to, affect policy with your local representatives?
Not really. Based on their response, no, it is not. The data that I have does not show that to be effective in producing a policy change. However, it might be the only time I think it might be effective, and this is more of a hunch than anything I can prove quantitatively, is that if it's something that they already agree with. So let's say you're a school board that's not going to implement masks no matter what, and you get 300, form letters saying masks are not good. You might be able to cite that as evidence as to why you're not changing your mind. But you're not going to see that have a huge policy impact because typically, based on the board members I spoke to, they can tell it's a form letter even when you start tweaking it. And based on my read of them, I could tell it was a form letter because you saw 300 emails come in a 10-minute period, and they were all identical except for the person signing it and the name of the child that they were a parent or grandparent of. So while those may matter, I don't think they have the same memorable influence that a true communication does, where someone's like, hey, I'm a member of your district. I vote. Here is my concern. Here's why I'm concerned. Thanks so much. Have a nice day. I think those are far more to the point, far more memorable and far more influential than just being one of 1,000 form letters.
What are your plans to put your research into the hands of school board members and school district administrators? What do you hope they'll do with the information?
I'm not sure what I hope they'll do with the information other than maybe be slightly more responsive to constituent appeals. But in terms of getting my information to them, this was a huge time investment from school district treasurers. Treasurers are typically the ones who are responsible for filing and filling public records requests. So they're the ones who are responsible for getting all the emails from every school board member and then making sure they were what I wanted and then getting them to me. And often they worked in conjunction with their district technology coordinator, but it was a huge time suck on the part of the districts. And so what I did is prior to kind of Zoom talk in my department, I emailed every treasurer who had participated, every school board member that I had interviewed, not all school board members were aware that I was doing this. If they chose not to participate, I stopped emailing them because I don't think they really wanted to hear from me any further. But I'm going to hopefully be able to publish something with this, and then I can send further follow-ups.
What do you hope will be the impact of your work generally, both in the realm of political science research and at the level of community political engagement?
Better and more equitable representation, having everyone's voice heard, within knowing that we're working within the limits of a system that doesn't want that. And so I think finding ways to make individual voices heard when a system is structured to mute them is important.
What advice do you have for young people who may be interested in politics or want to get more involved in their local communities?
Vote, write, communicate at the most local level, go to school board meetings, go to city council meetings, speak, participate. Those are probably the most accessible when you're young and you're not going to be traveling to your state capital or to DC to actually walk into someone's office. But at the most local level, show up.
Thanks so much for joining me today, Niki. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Listeners can keep up with ICS happenings by following us on Twitter and Instagram at ICS BGSU and on our Facebook page. You can listen to Big Ideas wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please subscribe or follow and rate us on your preferred platform. For more information or to suggest a topic for a future episode, visit bgsu.edu/BG Ideas. Our producers are Chris Cavera and Marco Mendoza, with sound engineering by DeAnna, MacKeigan, and Marco Mendoza. Research assistance was provided by Branson Young, with editing by Kari Hanlin.